Acho que começamos. Boa noite, pessoal. Antes da nosso encerramento aqui, nossa fala de encerramento, eu queria falar algumas coisas sobre o nosso encontro, né? Agora que finalizamos todas as nossas 8 mesas. E, bom, em nome da coordenação, da comissão de coordenação, da comissão científica, a gente não conversou ainda, mas pelas trocas de mensagem que a gente teve no WhatsApp durante o congresso, o encontro, né, esse encontro de economia institucional original, eu acho que nós chegamos à conclusão já, podemos dizer, não antecipada, mas que podemos já pensar que foi um sucesso, né? E eu acho que coisas novas podem ser construídas a partir daqui. Eu queria agradecer todo mundo que participou, pensando o congresso, fazendo ele, botando a mão na massa, né? Todos os comentaristas, né? Que é a comissão científica mesmo, quem foi lá, doou parte do seu tempo, né? Para fazer com que o institucionalismo não só crescesse, mas se tornasse o que se pode tornar agora, né? Está fazendo um esforço, né? Para a gente se conectar, para a gente fazer coisas juntos, vários trabalhos, várias apresentações que muitas pessoas não conheciam os outros, falam, nossa, mas você estuda isso também? Nossa, aquela pessoa estuda Furtado, o outro também estuda, olha como ele leu o Veblen, olha como eu leio o Veblen. Era isso que nós queríamos e eu acho que isso foi alcançado, né, que gerar possibilidades de conexões entre os institucionalistas brasileiros. Então, eu agradeço muito a participação de todos, de todas, mesas instigantes, mesas com um espírito institucionalista que nós carregamos no Brasil, né? Um espírito institucionalista com as nossas preocupações, as preocupações que nós temos aqui no Brasil, que tem uma certa peculiaridade, que tem certas questões aqui que só nós podemos pensar, né? Então, eu queria agradecer todo mundo. Daqui a pouco, o Jonathan, que também é na nossa comissão, né? Ele já nos disse que vai ter os anais, né? Vão estar publicados na segunda-feira. Qualquer problema que vocês tiverem, vocês já sabem o meu e-mail, vocês sabem até meu WhatsApp, né? Então, vocês podem entrar em contato e nós vamos, a partir de hoje, né, já pensar o que vamos fazer, né? E eu convido todo mundo para pensar junto, né? Quais são os próximos passos que nós vamos dar juntos, né? Dentro a partir deste encontro, né? Porque isso aqui realmente faz jus ao nome, né? Foi um encontro de economia institucional. Então, eu queria parabenizar todos. Tudo que eu vi, eu gostei. Eu achei muito interessante, achei interessante todos os debates, achei interessante a interação. Eu acho que não poderia ser melhor do que foi. Tá ok? Agora eu vou convidar o nosso a fala de fechamento, né, que nós convidamos o professor Tae-Hee, né, da Universidade the University of the State University of New York, sunny Buffalo State. Let me put Tae-Hee here. Okay, it shares. Okay, no, I think it's better like this. Okay, welcome, Tae-Hee. Thank you for accepting our invitation for this closing speech at Einst at our conference. It's an honor to have you here. Thank you a lot. And I will just introduce you for the audience, and then we can start. Okay? Ok, Tae-Hee é um professor associado no Departamento de Finanças e Economia da State University of New York, Buffalo State. Tae-Hee recebeu o doutorado, né, pela Universidade de Missouri, Kansas City, PhD, né, sob a orientação do Frederick Lee, um velho conhecido dos nossos estudos institucionalistas, né? Sua pesquisa foca na teoria da empresa industrial, governança de mercado e regulação de mercado. Ele publicou artigos e resenhas em diversas revistas, né? Quem gosta de ler todos os trimestres o seu Journal of Economic Issues, você vai encontrar muitas vezes artigos do Tae-Hee são artigos instigantes, né? E isso é uma das razões que nós decidimos trazer aqui, porque nós temos um encontro que é instigante, né? E esse é um pensador do institucionalismo que ele, de alguma maneira, segue o nosso espírito, né? O espírito que eu acho que ficou muito evidente aqui no nosso encontro, né? Então ele fez resenhas, artigos em diversos journals, revistas, né? Journal of Economics and Society, the Journal of Economic Issues, Forum for Social Economics, Bulletin of the Political Economy, PSL Quarterly Review of Evolutionary Political Economy, Review of Social and Economic Studies, Review of Political Economy, Heterodox Economics Newsletters, and The Horizon. Ele foi coeditor do Heterodox Economics Newsletter. Eu indico que quem não segue o Heterodox Economics Newsletter, tem muita gente jovem, na verdade a maioria, a maior parte do nosso encontro são pessoas jovens que estão interessadas no institucionalismo, e é por isso que elas são heterodoxas, né? Então, quem não segue, procure na internet, Heterodox Economics Newsletter é uma curadoria de tudo o que está acontecendo na heterodoxia, certo? Hoje. Então, tem congressos, tem chamadas para publicação, tem summer school, tem emprego, né? Tem um monte de coisas ali que isso é enviado periodicamente, eu acho, por e-mail, então é muito legal vocês terem esse contato, né, com o que está acontecendo na economia heterodoxa. Ele é editor do Microeconomic Theory and Heterodox Approach, que é do Fred Lee, né? Mas o Tae-Hee editou. Ele é co-editor do Heterodox Economics Legacy and Prospects, que a fala de hoje do Tae-Hee ele é um capítulo está baseado num capítulo desse livro. Esse livro acabou de sair, é um livro editado com a Lynn Chester, então você pode procurar na Amazon, você vai encontrar, ele saiu do forno há 2 semanas atrás. Né? Ele também editou o Routledge Handbook of Heterodox Economics, em 2018, Advancing the Frontiers of Heterodox Economics, Essays in Honor of Frederick Lee, em 2016, e o Marx Veblen and the Foundations of Heterodox Economics, Essays in Honor of John Henry, de 2016. E temos outras publicações, mas são muitas, mas estou falando dos livros editados por ele. Né? A fala de hoje tem o nome, né, de Ideologias, Instituições e Economia Heterodoxa. E eu acho que esse título não poderia ser melhor, visto tudo que a gente discutiu nestes 2 dias. So, good afternoon, Tae-Hee. You can trust me, I said only good things about you. Okay. Yeah. And thank you again for accepting this closing speech. And the floor is yours.
All right. Great.
Please.
Hello, everyone. I'm Tae-Hee. I thank Professor Manuel Hamon and the conference committee for inviting me to this first Encontro de Economía Institucional Original. And I'm glad to be a part of this first conference, and I'm happy to be here. All right. My talk is about ideology, institution, and heterodox economics. And this talk is based on a chapter in a recently published book. I believe Professor Hamon just talked about this book a few seconds ago. Yes, this is one of the chapters in the book. Uh, I just want to say that if you want to know about the current debate around the heterodox economics, probably you should take a look at this volume and you can find a lot of interesting and new arguments made by heterodox economists from various traditions. And also there is excellent Brazilian heterodox economist, Daniela Guizot, who she is contributing to this volume as well. And she made an excellent argument about the heterodox economics. So let me start my presentation. Um, there is a recurring critique of heterodox economics. But of course, there are lots of critiques of heterodox economics. One of them is this: heterodox economists are ideologically biased, and therefore they are unable to assess mainstream economics on the scientific ground and to provide a valid theoretical alternative to mainstream economics. This kind of critique is made by both mainstream and heterodox economists. And this critics raises some questions that I'm going to deal with in my presentation. For example, what is ideology and what is science? And can economics be free of ideology? And also, is heterodox economics ideologically biased? What does it mean and to what extent? And then, is mainstream economics a science, whereas heterodox economics is not? There are lots of questions to be answered, but of course, I cannot deal with all of the questions in my presentation, but I will try to make some cases against the critic that I mentioned at the start. And my main argument can be summarized in the following 4 points. Firstly, I'm going to argue that ideology is a social institution. Secondly, economics is both ideology and science. And thirdly, trained incapacity is the ideological function of mainstream economics. And lastly, heterodox economics is an intellectual, social, and scientific enterprise aiming at advancing our understanding of the world in which we live. So let's start with ideologies and institutions. I have looked at various literature on ideology and also on science, and it seems to me that there are at least three different types of ideology. So I named them ideology 1 to 3. So let me briefly talk about those three types of ideology. Ideology 1, which is mostly widely received by people and also scholars. And this ideology refers to ideas promoting a specific political or ethical value. Oftentimes, this kind of ideology is false or illusory. I'm talking about the political ideology, aggressive nationalism, neoliberalism, laissez-faireism, racism, sexism, and climate change denialism. Second type of ideology is this. It refers to a system of thought and ideas regarding society. That is to say, how we understand or conceptualize the surrounding world and how we make a judgment about someone else's idea. Examples are worldview, social ontology, preconception. This is the term used by Veblen, or Schumpeter's pre-analytical vision. So there is a big difference between the first type of ideology and the second one. If an idea is false and illusory, promoting a particular political or ethical value, then this ideology one is in contradiction to the genuine meaning of science. However, the ideology two, which is not in contradiction to science in the sense of searching for truth, because that kind of work or process should be based upon some kind of worldview. That's what I'm talking about. And what I'm concerned about, and what I'm going to talk about in the following slides, is the third type of ideology. It refers to a system of thought purporting to be scientific, but in fact promoting an abstract and idealized worldview by utilizing a seemingly scientific method, such as mathematics. So we may call it scientific ideology or pseudoscience. Examples are, I would argue, and I will explain more later, social Darwinism and mainstream economics. And I hope now you have a clear understanding of three different types of ideology. So I've just mentioned about the third type of ideology. And let me give you some examples of this. Since the mid-20th century in the US and elsewhere, the IQ measurement, intellectual quotient measurement, is used to claim that African Americans are genetically inferior to white Americans, or women are genetically inferior and weaker than men. So this kind of view, combined with some science, manifests itself in racial and gender pay gaps, unequal social status, unequal distribution of income and wealth, as if such differences are natural, normal, and universal phenomenon. Consequently, it is believed that nothing could improve innate inferiority and legitimize a policy restricting immigration from a particular country and scaling back the welfare system and public education. So we have seen those policies in the US, in other countries as well, because people, both policymakers and uh, academic economists and social scientists, believe that that is a scientific the argument, but it is not, because there is no convincing and evidence to support that kind of argument. Now, earlier I mentioned that another example of the third type of ideology is mainstream economics. Let me talk about it briefly. So, due to a false or unscrupulous idea clothed in a scientific method, it is hard, if not impossible, to distinguish ideology 3 from science. However, I argue that mainstream economics is an example of an ideology 3 to the extent that the core mainstream economic doctrines, such as the law of demand and supply, equilibrium, utility profit maximization, free competitive market, and Pareto optimality, combined with mathematical logic, ideologically laden hypothetical ideas leading to either ignoring observed facts or selectively using or misusing facts to fit them into an ordained ideological vision of the world. That's the virtual reality of Homo economicus. It's not about the real world that we are living in. And more specifically, let me quote Lionel Robbins and James Buchanan. Here is Robbins. from his 1932 book, we may examine the case of minimum wage regulation. It is a well-known generalization of theoretical economics that a wage which is held above the equilibrium level necessarily involves unemployment and a diminution of the value of capital. This is one of the most elementary deductions from the theory of economic equilibrium. The history of this country, the UK, since the war is one long vindication of its accuracy. Let me read Buchanan. Just as no physicist would claim that water runs uphill, no self-respecting economist would claim that increases in the minimum wage increase employment. Such a claim, if seriously advanced, becomes equivalent to a denial that there is even minimal scientific content in economics, and that, in consequence, economists can do nothing but write as advocates for ideological interest. Now, we have to think about what the Robbins, Buchanan, and other mainstream economists have long argued, have long the, supported using their mainstream theory. Do you really believe that raising minimum wage will increase unemployment? Well, if you look at empirical data, that's not the case. But they're arguing that if you say otherwise, that's an ideologically biased economic theory. Now, heterodox economists have long shown that most product prices, wage rate, interest rate are administered by either the business enterprise or the state. Changes in demand and supply are not connected to price changes. Marginal cost, marginal revenue, and marginal productivity play virtually no role in making production, employment, and investment decisions because those concepts do not exist in the real world. The real world business managers do not calculate marginal cost. We do not calculate marginal utility to make a consumption decision. If those empirical studies are correct, then we cannot say that there is the law of demand and supply, which means that, as many heterodox economists, as well as economic sociologists and philosophers argue for many years, the market price mechanism or the law of supply and demand is a myth. Now, are empirical studies and their conclusion ideologically biased, or Lionel Robbins, James Buchanan, and mainstream economists who prioritize theoretical doctrines over empirical facts ideologically biased? Here is Fred Lee's answer to that question. And he was my advisor, who was kind of the leader in the heterodox economics movement until he died in 2014. But let me take a look at what he's talking about, and I will talk more about him later. Because neoclassical theory is not grounded in reality. It does not deal with social considerations and is internally, theoretically incoherent. It lacks truth and value and contributes nothing to explaining the social provisioning process in a capitalist economy. That is, neoclassical theory is a pseudoscience with illusory knowledge or pseudo-knowledge, and hence is not a scientific theory and cannot be a scientific research program. He made this argument based on his theoretical work and also his empirical work. So it's not simply some kind of critique of mainstream theory based on his own political ideological viewpoint. So as I said, I will get back to him later because his argument is very important to understand how to understand that ideology in economics. So why is that? Why is it that many economists, supposedly scientists, who are supposed to explain factual reality, advance an illusory idea which deeply influences people's thought and conduct? To answer this question, we have to understand that ideology is a social institution. It is a pervasive and elusive social institution which takes many different forms. Ideology can be political, cultural, and theoretical, could be religious, and it is created and promoted by a class of people in the specific historical and social setting and becomes, once it gains sufficient popularity in society, an indispensable part of the human life process. It manifests itself through people's thought and conduct. That's what Veblen meant by institution. It has power to mold and change habits of thinking and acting. In addition to that, to become dominant and effective, an ideology has to be consistent with the interest of the ruling class. So, for example, we have seen that the income inequality between classes has been widening everywhere around the world. So, whether the widening gap between the classes is socially allowable or not depends upon the success of the supporting ideology, which provides an illusion that the current economic circumstance is natural and normal, and hence that there is no alternative to the existing social order. So, for an illusory idea to be accepted widely in society, it has to be masked by a scientific pretense. I can talk about three examples, but of course, there are lots of examples here. Plato and his silver class, referring to the intellectuals and the military. And this particular class developed a particular ideology to protect and promote the interest of the golden class, that's the ruling class. So the slavery system was supported because of this work done by intellectuals and military force. Another example, the combination of the illusion or ideology with science. It is social Darwinism. It is a mixture of biological science and the Panglossian worldview promoted by the ruling class of the 18th century that the existing social order is the best of the all possible worlds. It reinforces the status quo to the extent that people believe any reformative or transformative actions will only impede the natural selection process of the fittest. If you closely look at a lot of works done by evolutionary economists, especially the mainstream evolutionary economists, you will find this social Darwinian idea. Not mention the mainstream doctrines. Those doctrines imply the natural selection process of the fittest. Therefore, this kind of idea legitimizes the status quo, those people who already accumulated huge wealth and property. Now, let me move on to the ideology and science in economics. So, as I mentioned earlier, for science to be accepted, its knowledge claims have to be questioned, tested, and validated or confirmed by reality. That's how we understand the science. However, economics has developed in the social historical context in which illusions, false beliefs, fake information, and ignorance are often stimulated rather than curbed. A more successful mainstream economic research, in the sense of wider reception, is therefore likely to be the one which is aligned with the dominant ideology of the time. So the reason that neoclassical economics becomes the mainstream is not because of the better theory or better models, but because of its ideas, its theories and models are comfortably aligned with the dominant idea or dominant ideology of the capitalist society. That's what it implies. So, in that regard, economics is both science and ideology to the extent that it is partly a vehicle for the ruling ideology of each period, as well as partly a method of scientific investigation. This is the quote from John Robinson. However, heterodox economists and mainstream economists have completely different views on ideology and value. Heterodox economics originated from and also in line with classical political economy views the economics as the science of social provisioning of resources, care, and power in the propertied hierarchical society where people's diverse interests are in conflict. Therefore, ideology is part of economics and the value fact dichotomy is hardly tenable. Mainstream economics originated from the marginalist revolution in the 19th century and neoclassical economics. And here is the most well-known definition of economics by the Lionel Robbins. The science which studies human behavior as a relationship between ends and scarce means which have alternative uses. And this definition of economics leads to the following: positive economics, which means that any ideology or value judgment should be avoided. Then what's the problem with this positivist position or approach to economics? I think that, and as many others, economists and philosophers have argued, positive economics is ideologically biased. By removing economic analysis from changing reality and history and from social institutions, mainstream economics promotes the illusory, harmonious view of society with the equilibrium state, free market, full employment, and maximum social welfare, as if such a society is achievable under capitalism. So it is not surprising that mainstream neoclassical economics is the theoretical basis of neoliberalism or market fundamentalism, the two main figures, Milton Friedman and Gary Becker. Now, so positive mainstream economics is ideologically biased, which is in contradiction to their position on value and ideology. Well, there is a very well-known the statement by Joseph Schumpeter, and I can use it. Ironically, mainstream economists find ideological bias only in other, never in themselves. So for later, I will show some data about the ideological bias in mainstream economics. But before that, heterodox economists, especially the John Robinson, Ronald Meek, and others, understand that it is impossible to have ideology-free economics. So what do I mean by that? Let me just move on to the second quote from Robinson. Pretending to be objective and value neutral is either self-deception or a device to deceive others. To eliminate value judgment from the subject matter of social science is to eliminate the subject itself, for since it concerns human behavior, it must be concerned with the value judgment that people make. So the point is that economics would be an uncontested ideology-free discipline only if the society in question were the harmonious, conflictless, organic whole in which there is no disadvantaged, alienated, and exploited person. Such a society exists only in the most unrealistic economic models. That's why it is impossible to remove the ideology or values completely from doing economics. Now, heterodox economics, I would argue that, is a scientific enterprise. Although ideology is an unavoidable part of economics, heterodox economics is not a set of ideologically biased claims. Heterodox economics is a scientific enterprise which is, unlike its mainstream counterpart, not afraid of exploring and acknowledging the ideological functions of economics. So most heterodox economists are cautious in developing their own theory and judging others' analysis. This is what Clarence Ayers means by ideological responsibility in doing economics. Now, it is quite obvious that lots of heterodox economic theories are politically radical in the sense that it has a radical implication because the investigation of capitalism and its social foundations leads to such a position rather than the reverse. I think that's how Marx developed his ideas, his theories, and I think that's how Thorstein Veblen developed his institutional economics. As an intellectual, social, and scientific activity, heterodox economics is a system of evolving body of knowledge which advances our understanding of society, of which ideology is part. So we cannot simply remove all the ideological aspect in society in developing our theory of the capitalist society. Um, so let me move on to the third part of my presentation, and this is about the ideological bias in economics. The success of mainstream economics is nothing but the failure of education, in the sense that successful mainstream economics teaching not only separate students from the reality they face daily, but also alienate economics education from genuine educational purposes. So I'm a teacher, so I have lots of young students, the first year, second year, even graduate students. So I find this when I teach my students in class, they are not trained to think of alternatives. For instance, a society in which human dignity and well-being are given priority over market efficiency, equality over invidious distinction and discrimination, ecological sustainability over economic growth, and capital accumulation, and goods making over money making, shared prosperity over the prosperity for the rich and the privileged. This is what Veblen meant by trained incapacity. The trained incapacity of thinking differently and critically is an outcome of the way mainstream economics is taught, and it obviously contributes to the preservation of the status quo. A couple of examples here. So, as I mentioned, when I talk to my student in class, and when I talk to mainstream economists in my department, they have a firm belief in free markets, including free trade and market efficiency, even though they have experienced the financial crisis of 2008 and 9, even though we are going through this terrible COVID-19 pandemic, and we have seen, especially in the United States, the malfunctioning and inefficient allocation of resources in the healthcare market, so to speak. It's not working. However, still they believe in the free market, including the healthcare market. There is a very interesting empirical study done by Zavdani and Chang. Chang is the Hajun Chang at the Cambridge, and they surveyed 2,400 economists around the world. And one of the results that I found very interesting was this: mainstream economists tend to reject any idea if it is put forward by a heterodox economist, whereas heterodox economists tend to evaluate an idea regardless of ideological orientation. So certainly, I think that there are some biases in the way that mainstream economists do economics. Now, let me talk about this question. Is a different ideological position anti-scientific? This is one of the arguments made by a lot of mainstream economists. Indeed, mainstream economics is ideologically diverse, but the dominant position is the priority of the unregulated free market over any other social institutions as a way to allocate resources. So from the orthodox dogmatic mainstream standpoint, any theoretical arguments challenging the core neoclassical doctrines are allegedly ideologically biased because such a challenge demands doubt over the worldview contained in the doctrines. So therefore, a different ideological position is blamed for being anti-scientific, anti-democratic, anti-market, and anti-moral without providing sufficient reason or evidence to say so. Then what? Why do they deny their own ideology at the same time blame others for being ideologically biased? Because the denial of own ideology in fact defends and justifies one's ideological position as if it was scientific. A good example is the Mont Society and its support for neoliberalism. If you look at the statement purpose of this society, which is available online, you can clearly see their purpose and what they are trying to do. What's interesting is that, which is relevant to our current discussion, this Mont Society positions itself against any intellectual and social movement associated with collective challenges to the private property system and with the planning and control of the market mechanism, as they were allegedly an ideological movement which should be countered by their own intellectual argument. So from this perspective, this standpoint, free society, free market, free competition, free enterprise, free trade, and freedom of individuals are believed to be the natural, normal, and universal position which should be protected and promoted for the common good of the entire society. So it follows that then there is only one vision of a good society. That is the neoliberal ideal, which can be achieved by scientific studies. That's what they believe. Let me move on to the next part. I'm going to talk about heterodox economics and some critics of heterodox economics. So, as I mentioned at the start of my presentation uh, about the critique of heterodox economics, that heterodox economists are unable to assess the mainstream economics on the scientific ground. It rejects mainstream economics for its pro-market neoliberal ideology without providing a valid theoretical alternative, etc. The problem I see in this kind of critique is that they conflate different meanings of ideology. There is a confusion between ideologies 1, 2, and 3, and between an ideological theory and a theory of ideology. Therefore, those critics are not only misplaced but also inimical to the development of heterodox economics, because any study pointing out the ideological function of mainstream economics is accused of being ideologically biased. Well, if you're familiar with various traditions in heterodox economics, you will immediately notice that there is a diverse political ideology in heterodox economics. For example, Keynes and most post-Keynesians try to save capitalism from its demise by stabilizing the economic system and achieving full employment by way of active state innovation. However, Klasky, Schroff, and John Robinson, they questioned the fundamental structures of capitalism and envisioned an alternative system. Institutionalism. Veblen's theories are more radical. That's what I read Veblen's work. Than those of Commons and Ayers, who, like Keynes, were concerned primarily with the improvement of capitalism in favor of working class and the general public. And also there is radical institutionalism combining Veblen's and Marx's ideas. According to this tradition, the provisioning of material resources is organized and controlled by the minority ruling class at the expense of the welfare of the underlying population, the working class. An alternative system which puts an end to exploitation, invidious distinction, and discrimination is supported by this tradition. The reason I'm talking about this different political ideology is that heterodox economics is not organized around a left-wing political ideology. This is the argument made by a well-known, eminent institutional economist, Jeff Hudson, in his 2019 book. I want to talk about Fred Lee a little bit, as I mentioned earlier, because Jeff Hudson, in his book, accused Fred Lee of being ideologically biased in his work, his theoretical work. That's what uh, Hudson is arguing. Well, I think Hudson is quite wrong because he doesn't know exactly about the Fred Lee's theoretical work. I believe I know Fred Lee very well because I was his student and I'm still doing my work in line with what Fred Lee did. So I can say this. Lee was critical of any theories, mainstream or heterodox, that do not help understand the world in which we live regardless of political ideology. For example, he was critical of or rejecting the Straussian long period approach, and he rejected the Marx labor value theory, but not its implications, but the way that the value theory is developed. And heterodox theories supporting the market price mechanism, etc. Did he reject those theories because of his political ideology? And also, I have to mention that Fred Lee was probably the most radical heterodox economist associated with the International Workers of the World, the Global Labor Union. However, when I read his work, his theoretical work, it's not about the political movement, not about political ideology. From his viewpoint, the purpose of developing heterodox theory is to explain how the economy works and how the capitalist provisioning process and behaviors therein are organized. So the reason heterodox economics is against mainstream's market fundamentalism is because the latter is theoretically and empirically flawed, not because of heterodoxy's left-wing ideology. So from Fred Lee's viewpoint, and also my viewpoint, and many other institutionalists and other heterodox economists' viewpoint. We are trying to explain the changing reality, evolving capitalist economic system. So the objective of heterodox economics is providing a historical narrative of economic activities situated in social relationships and institutions which pertain to the provisioning of material and non-material resources needed by people. So heterodox economists understand that the objection to mainstream economics, its pro-market ideology or incoherent theory is not sufficient to develop heterodox economics. What's more important, what's required, is the development of heterodox economic theories that are internally coherent and externally relevant. If critics of heterodox economics, as well as advocates of the capitalist market system, are found both in mainstream and heterodox economics, it is wrong to argue that heterodox economics is organized around the leftist or anti-market ideology. Okay, so this is the last part. Let me conclude my talk. I have 5 bullet points, and 2 of them about ideology and economics. Mainstream economists and the critics of heterodox economics construe ideology and science narrowly. They thus confuse a scholar's view which guides a scientific work with a false or illusory idea which has no historical and scientific ground. This confusion leads to a wrong accusation of heterodox economics. Secondly, ideology is a social institution which reflects underlying social foundations and social environment. The dominant approach in economics is the one which is aligned comfortably with the dominant interests of the society. As the ruling class of a hierarchical society requires the justification of inequality in terms of power and wealth, invidious discrimination and exploitation in order to protect the existing social order, then what can heterodox economists do? Heterodox economics provides a historically and socially informed narrative of how capitalism works and evolves. Heterodox economics is an intellectual, social, and scientific enterprise aiming at advancing our understanding of the world in which we live. Economics is serviceable to society when it explains the causal mechanisms and institutional arrangements that are germane to the well-being of people, when it provides an explanatory framework that helps understand the changing world, and it provides policy prescriptions that can be used to improve the provisioning process in the real world. Such basic purposes of economics are not likely to be achieved if economics moves away from the reality by creating an ideal world. If economists are not aware of their ideological, methodological position, and if they are not responsible for the impact of their scientific enterprise on society. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Tae-Hee for your presentation. at the first time we met, you informed me that your presentation could be controversial.
Yeah, yeah,
and
I said
and yeah, and now I seeing your presentation, I see it's not controversial but very thoughtful and completely aligned with our conference and what we saw the 2 days of this conference. So thank you very much for that.
yeah.
I have two questions here.
Okay.
I'll make two questions for you.
Mhm.
The first question is from Professor Os Yazdi. He says, Professor Joe, you said market price mechanism is a myth. Could we say that the belief in market price mechanism is an ideology as well? If the answer is positive, what is the main difference between myths and the three definitions of ideology?
Okay.
Okay. And the second question is from Professor Felipe Almeida. He says, Tae-Hee, good seeing you. Thank you very much for your speech. It gave us a lot of food for thought. If you let me ask a question, in your perspective, how ideology promoted by mainstream economics can be fought? That's the second question. And I have a question myself for you, because as we see in your presentation, you follow the legacy of the great heterodox economist Frederick Lee. And there are some papers from Fred Lee about economic pluralism. And he said something that's it's very interesting for this discussion you promote now. That is the idea that he fight this idea of mainstream economics as a pluralist field, an idea that was very was pointed by David Colander, that mainstream economics is pluralist. And okay, Fred Lee says no, it's not. In fact, heterodox economics is pluralist, and he shows that. He shows that we publish in different heterodox journals, and we go to different heterodox meetings and conference. And regarding this perspective, how can we fight? And this follows a lot of Felipe Almeida's questions. How can we fight mainstream economic with the flag of economic pluralism within heterodoxy? And what is the role of institutional economics in this process? Because on the first, our opening speech by Octavio Conceição, Sebastião Guedes, and Ramon Fernandes, one of the main points of this speech was that Brazilian institutionalists should engage in conversation with other heterodox fields, to engage in a heterodox conversations. That is an important task for Brazilian institutionalists. So I would like if you can give us a word on this perspective of, on Fred Lee's perspective of heterodox pluralism as the only kind of possible pluralism for economics. Thank you.
Thank you for the questions. So let me start with Professor Yasti's question. I hope I pronounce your name correctly. So, and his main concern is about the market price mechanism. Then, yes, I argue that this market price mechanism, or the law of supply and demand, is a myth. in the sense that we don't find this functional or structural relationship between price and quantity in the real world market empirically. That's one reason. Because to support this idea, this theory, you have to show sufficient evidence to say that. But there are numerous studies, empirical studies, as well as theoretical studies, showing that there is no such law in the real world market. It goes back to Veblen, and it goes back to the cardinal means in the 1930s. And also I mentioned the Oxford Economist Research Group and others. Then the question continues, what is the difference between the myth and the one of those ideologies that I mentioned in my presentation? Now, that's a pretty good question, and we can think of this question in different ways. Firstly, the market price mechanism, which is the law of demand and supply, is not grounded in the real world market. It is an illusory view. However, so in that sense, it is our ideology one. However, this view, the market price mechanism, supported by the almost all the mainstream economists and marginalists for many years now, but they would argue that it can be a scientific claim because we can develop this theoretical claim using mathematical logic. And also they would argue that, look, there are some markets in the real world, and those markets resemble what the law of supply and demand says. This is precisely what the Milton Friedman was arguing in his 1953 book, right? There's no problem with having some unrealistic assumptions because the purpose of theory is to predict what's happening in the real world. But of course, there are lots of problems with that kind of argument. So I would say that, yes, the market price mechanism is a myth in the sense of the ideology one, but also it is an ideology in the sense of ideology three, which is the I say pseudoscience, which looks like a science, but it is not because it is not grounded in the real world. So my main argument, one of the arguments with regard to the different concepts of ideologies, that if something, your argument, your claim is completely independent of the reality and history, then it is an ideology. But of course, it's very difficult to show lots of empirical evidence to support a particular theoretical claim. That's why there are many empirical studies are incomplete. But still, science is a process or searching for truth. It's not just a truth, right? I hope I answered your question, Professor Yasti. And Professor Philip Armada's question is about, and I can actually see his question on the right-hand side because he wrote in English. Thank you, Philip. All right. How we can fight? I think that's his question. The fight against the mainstream economics. And I don't think I have the answer, but the many heterodox economists in the past and present have shown us how to fight. Well, we need to develop a better theory, better in the sense of a theory supported by changing reality and evidence. And also at the same time, we have to develop a community of heterodox economists. What I'm saying is, you can organize a conference, you can organize a seminar, and you can have a social network with like-minded people located around the world. And those kinds of activities are essential for first developing a community of heterodox economists. And when heterodox economists are organized in some way, and then they have a way to fight against mainstream economics in a collective manner. That's why it is difficult, but it is important. I mean, the organizing the heterodox economists scattered around the world. That's why I think this first Brazilian institutional economist conference is very important, and it could be the first step toward organizing institutionalists in Brazil, and which is partly related to Professor Manuel Ramon's question. So, well, let's get back to Professor Almeida's question. Yes, I mentioned about developing theory and developing a community. And one more thing, there are lots of things we can do as teachers of economics in classroom. I mentioned a couple of times in my presentation about my experience in classrooms. So I communicate with my student and I try to link economic theories with what we see, what we experience in the real world. When we have that kind of link in our class conversation, I find that they actually understand those difficult economic theories. So I think this is very important. Otherwise, I mean, if we don't tell them what's going on out there, if we don't connect economic theories to the reality, then they have no idea what they are doing. As I mentioned, using Thorstein-Veblen's term, they are not capable of thinking differently and critically. I think this is another very important job we can do, teaching our students. And we have to enlighten them. We have to tell them what's going on. Well, this is not about some particular political ideology, because this is what we are supposed to do as economists. Well, I hope I have answered Professor Almeida's question. And now, Professor Manuel Ramon's question. And You brought up a very important question, which is also related to what the Professor Almeida mentioned. Uh, so let me talk about the pluralism first. Some heterodox economists tend to assume that pluralism, means just we need to, pluralism means the engagement with any approaches, any ideas. Well, there could be one meaning of pluralism. So inside mainstream economics, we find that new Keynesians and new classicals, they talk to each other, although they debate on many different issues, but they talk to each other. They meet at conferences. They organize conferences together, which is a kind of uh, intra-pluralism within the mainstream economics. And of course, within heterodox economics, we have a bunch of different traditions. It sometimes seems that the difference between the Marxian economics and institutional economics is too big to be reconciled. But another times, I see that there are people who talk to each other. So we have those radical institutionalists such as William Duggar and William Waller, and also John Henry. So it is possible to communicate with each other within the heterodox economics boundaries. So this is another example of intra-pluralism. Now, then there is another kind of pluralism, which is inter-pluralism, so to speak, which means that some people argue, like David Callender, Buckley Rosser, and also Jeff Hudson, and also those heterodox economists at New School and other places. They argue that heterodox economists should communicate with mainstream economists because there are lots of things heterodox economists can learn from mainstream economics. There are lots of things that mainstream economists can learn from heterodox economists. This sounds great, but the history tells us a different story. What I'm saying is that heterodox economists have always been open to mainstream economists and their ideas. However, mainstream economists have always been close to heterodox ideas, but sometimes they borrow ideas from heterodox economics and they use them as if they have created that idea on their own. So the point is that heterodox economists, lots of them, but not all of them, are quite open to mainstream economics. That's what we mean by inter-pluralism. However, mainstream economists are not for many reasons, and probably they don't need to talk to heterodox economics and the heterodox economists. So this is one of the arguments made by Fred Lee, and he talked about it in the Review of Radical Political Economics articles, and also there is a book in defense of post-Keynesian heterodox economics, and there are lots of good arguments made by heterodox economists, including Fred Lee. So Friedrich had a very interesting position, and some people think his position was unrealistic because he his position is very strong, something like this. We don't have to worry about the mainstream economic theories because heterodox economics is independent of mainstream economics. What I'm saying is that, let's suppose, certainly, mainstream economics disappears. Does it mean that heterodox economics disappears as well? The answer is no, because heterodox economics has its own origins, its own philosophical and theoretical frameworks. Although heterodox economics is the minority in the economics discipline. So the point is that, well, heterodox economists are willing to talk to mainstream economists, but that's not always the case, except some well-known heterodox economists like Jeff Hudson. Then what should we do? What can be done to advance heterodox economics? As I mentioned earlier, well, we have to keep developing a better theory, better than the mainstream theories. And also we have to organize heterodox economists. And also we have to keep teaching our students. So that's why it's very important to the develop heterodox economics curriculum. Could be a part of the or could it be a one part of the conventional economics curriculum, or could it be something else? So it depends upon how individual heterodox economists educate their own students, but the point is research, community, and teaching. So I think there is another the question raised by Professor Hamon. Then what is the role of the institutional economics? I think that's the question. By the way, do I have enough time? It's already 1 hour 22.
Don't worry. Don't worry.
All right.
We have a lot of time.
Yeah.
Take your time.
All right. Good. Now, I have to say that I'm not a pure institutionalist because I was educated in the program where institutionalists, post-Keynesians, and Marxist ideas were taught. So I got lots of influences from those different heterodox economics traditions. But I find Thorstein Veblen and Marx most inspirational because they talk about the fundamental structure and its evolution in the capitalist system. Now, in particular, Veblen's ideas inquiring into the institutions of capitalism and capitalist society. I think institutions as the starting point of economic studies. I think that's a very important thing that we have to remember because eventually, whether you are a post-Keynesian or a Marxian or even neoclassical economics, economist who's concerned about the making the economy and society a better place, we have to deal with institutions. So I think that post-Keynesians are institutionalist in some sense, and also Marxians are institutionalist. The point I'm trying to make here is that this institutionalist economics is a kind of basis of developing lots of theoretical argument, a lot of policies. So there are a lot of things institutionalists and Marxists can talk about, lots of things that institutionalists and post-Keynesians and others can work together. I think that matters. Even those theoretically minded heterodox economists, I have Luigi Pasnetti in my mind because he has been talking about institutions for some years now, and he published an article at the end of last year, which was about actually institutions. Luigi Pasnetti is a leading Straussian economist, and he developed a rigorous theoretical framework following Strauss. But his point is that, okay, we can start from a very pure theory. That's what he means by, I think he used the term pure theory. But he argues that even though we start with pure theory, we have to move on to applied theory, which means we have to take into account actually existing social institutions, meaning social arrangement and social organizations. Otherwise, that pure theory has no meaning. So I find his argument is interesting, although I do not completely agree with his theoretical work. So my point is that the institutional economic theories could be the basis of lots of important and good heterodox economic theories for developing modern monetary theory. And we know that those people associated with MMT are both post-Keynesians and institutionalists, and they say that they got lots of lessons from institutionalists. And also we know that there are lots of post-Keynesian institutionalists or institutionalist post-Keynesians. So I find that, this is my conclusion to the question, institutionalist economics is kind of a fundamental work, a basic work. It has its own meaning, and it has contributed to the development of heterodox economics as well. So that's how I view the role of institutionalist economics. Now, and also what I've just said is related to the last question, which is about the engagement of Brazilian institutionalist economists with heterodox economists around the world. I think that's very important. I have another advisor who's John Henry. He used to say this because we had a lot of communications, especially through the emails before he died. And once he said this, if you are isolated from like-minded people, you tend to think that you are insane. So you have to find others who share the same concerns and same interest, who can work together. That's why I earlier mentioned that it is very important to develop a community of heterodox economists, develop the social networks, and organizing a conference. This is very important. And although I don't understand Portuguese, I believe Professor Manuel Hamon mentioned at the beginning of the session about the Heterodox Economics newsletter, because I heard that. It was established by Fred Lee, and I think early 2000, something like 2006, I believe. The purpose of this newsletter was to organize heterodox economists scattered around the world. If you're just isolated somewhere in Buffalo, lots of snows here, right? Then you don't know what's going on out there. You don't know how what Brazilian institutionalist economists are doing in Brazil. So it is very important to engage with them. So that's why I'm very glad and thankful for inviting me to this nice conference. And I see it as a first step to organize Brazilian institutional economists. And also, I'm told Professor Manuel Hamon earlier before the session that probably, and if you organize the next conference, you should invite others from other countries, right? Who have similar interest, theoretical interest, and who have similar concerns. So we can help together. We can organize ourselves to make a better community of heterodox economists. So that was precisely the reason that Fred Lee was doing lots of things other than his own theoretical work to help heterodox economists, especially to help students of heterodox economists. Because if there is no student who is willing to learn heterodox economics, there is no future of heterodox economics. I hope I answered all your questions. And any other questions? If time allows, I can talk more about it.
I think we don't have more questions. What's very very thoughtful, and it's very interesting and nice to hear from you all these ideas, because you said a lot of things about how we can organize the role of heterodox economics within our society. So how can we organize our students? Even your speech about ideology, and this is completely aligned with our concerns here at Einstein, at our conference. So it wouldn't have another better speech than your speech for a closing speech for this conference. So thank you very much, Tae-Hee. Thank you very much for
Thank you.
your openness and for your cooperation with our efforts to make this network of Brazilian institutionalists. So thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Pessoal, finalizamos então o nosso encontro da melhor maneira possível. Agora podemos talvez comemorar, né? E porque daqui a pouco vamos trabalhar novamente, né? Acho que temos muito trabalho para fazer aqui no Instituto para levar à frente as ideias institucionalistas no Brasil e para nos organizar e para trabalhar em conjunto. Ok? Então, estamos encerrando o nosso encontro. Muito obrigado e é isso. Um abraço, pessoal.